Song has always been one of the most powerful forms of protest. It's a means through which to use art to express true feelings, and on the political side of things, music has always had the power to express what thousands, if not millions, of people are thinking. And boy did Vladimir Putin get a healthy dose of what many in his country are thinking recently. St. Petersburg erupted into protest, with hundreds of people singing a specific song to ensure that Putin heard their voices. Now Russia's president is paranoid. Putin is terrified that a coup is imminent as he sees his grip on the Russian people fading away. On October 15th, The Telegraph reported that hundreds of people, predominantly Russia's youngsters, gathered in St. Petersburg to launch a protest against Putin and his Kremlin cronies. These protesters had a very specific message, expressed through the song they chose. It's time for Putin to be overthrown so a new leader can take Russia in a different direction. The protest marked one of the rare occasions when public dissent occurred within a major Russian city, which goes to show how serious the protesters were. They live in a country where speaking out against Putin now carries the risk of severe punishment. But they gathered in their masses, along with street musicians, on October 14th to protest the very law that may see them all receive punishment. Russia's draconian new censorship law that labels practically any anti-war material extremist. We'll come back to that law later in the video, but first let's focus on the song that conveyed the protesters' message so ably. On the surface, the lyrics, which were chanted in unison by the crowd, may seem a little confusing. "Where have you been for 8 years, you fucking monsters? I want to watch ballet, let the swans dance," the crowd sang. "Let your grandpa tremble with excitement for Swan Lake." That song is called Co-operative Swan Lake, and it was written by a pro-Ukrainian rapper named Noize MC. To many inside Russia, The Telegraph reports, the specific song has become the anthem of the young and liberal, people whom Putin is trying to mobilize to send to die in their masses in Ukraine, and there's a very good reason why. Noize MC serves as an example of Russia's suppression of the arts. The singer, whose real name is Ivan Alexeyev, was one of the first to express his dissent to Putin's supposed special military operation when Russia invaded Ukraine. Knowing that he will be punished for doing so, Alexeyev fled to Lithuania, where he's continued to record music expressing his disgust for Putin and his country for his actions in Ukraine. Of course, the Kremlin hasn't taken any of this lying down. It's labeled Alexeyev a foreign agent, suggesting that he will be punished should he dare set foot on Russian territory again while Putin is still in power. If there is any doubt of that, we only need to look at one incident that occurred in March of this year to discover what the Russian establishment thinks of Noize MC. On March 7th, a pro-Russian gang set fire to the door of an apartment believed to be owned by Alexeyev. Perhaps the gang was hoping that it would be able to catch the singer out if he had returned to Russia, or it may have simply wanted to damage one of Noize MC's assets. Either way, it's clear that this attack was intentional rather than a random act of arson. Scrawled on the wall next to the door was a message intended for Alexeyev. "Greetings to the enemy and traitor Vanya Noize MC from the Pianist." The Pianist is a gang operating inside Russia, and it's targeted musicians before. Just over a week before attacking Noize MC's property, the gang also set fire to the door of the apartment owned by Leva by 2, who is another artist that Russia has labeled as a foreign agent. A similar message was left for Leva by 2. This is how artists who stand up to Putin are treated in Russia, and it's this kind of treatment that sparked the October 14th protest in St. Petersburg. The goal from the Kremlin's perspective is to silence any dissenting voices. After all, if Russians cannot hear dissent, they are more likely to go along with Putin's policies. Whether it's gangs or the Kremlin itself, suppression of opposing viewpoints is growing ever more common in Russia. However, not even Putin could silence the masses who protested using Noize MC's song, and Russia's leader can't even hope that the protest would be contained to one city and never heard by anybody else in Russia. There's footage, and it shows a crowd that is willing to stand up and fight for what it believes in. Shared by TVP World, the 2-minute video shows scores of people gathered together in the center of St. Petersburg. These are people who don't just want their voices to be heard, they also want their faces to be seen. Barely any masks are seen among the crowd, highlighting a remarkable lack of fear toward the potential Kremlin blowback that lies in their future. The crowd is jumping as it sings, and you can see people recording the entire event on their phones. Suppression of this protest isn't an option for Putin. That footage is already circulating both worldwide and within Russia. TVP World explains that Russia has already been failing to stop Noize MC's messages from getting out there. His work is banned on all platforms that Russia controls, so that hasn't stopped Russia's tech-savvy youngsters from getting their hands on it. Using virtual private networks or VPNs, the outlet says, Russians can still find the music that Putin doesn't want them to hear on YouTube. And that's exactly what they do in their millions. Noize MC's YouTube channel highlights that, as many of his music videos have racked up several million views each. Many of those views are coming from inside Russia, no matter how hard Putin tries to stop it, and the music seems to be inspiring an uprising. Let's hone in on Co-operative Swan Lake for a moment. The song that the protesters chose has strange lyrics, at least to anybody who isn't aware of a very specific aspect of Russian culture. But those lyrics do have meaning, as does the use of the ballet Swan Lake. Since the collapse of the Soviet Union, Swan Lake has been associated with social upheaval in Russia, Sky History reveals. Why? A strange Soviet-era policy reveals the answer. In 1982, 84 and 85, Sky History says, several Soviet leaders died. In an attempt to distract the population away from these deaths, along with any inclinations of causing political disturbances, Russian state TV stations played Swan Lake on a loop. Distracting and calming was the goal, but the unintentional outcome was that Swan Lake became associated with periods of unrest and unhappiness inside Russia. Fast forward to 1991 and Swan Lake was on a loop again. This time the ballet was being shown due to turmoil caused by Russia's impending signing of the new Union Treaty. Under that treaty, the Russian seat of power would be decentralized, leading to a more open and transparent society. At least that was the theory, and many at the top of the Russian table didn't like it. On August 19th, Gennady Yanayev, who was the vice president of the Soviet Union, worked alongside 7 conspirators to imprison Mikhail Gorbachev, who was the Soviet president and had spearheaded the new Union Treaty. Swan Lake was played to distract from the attempted coup, and it was this instance that led to Swan Lake becoming a symbol of hope in the power of social upheaval to the Russian masses. When the ballet played, Russia's people, indoctrinated by its past airings, knew that trouble was in the air. The Soviet coup failed after 3 days. But ever since, Swan Lake has been a symbol of protest in Russia, and it's for this reason that Noize MC's song was chosen for the St. Petersburg protest. It is overt in its references to the ballet and what it means to those who aren't happy with Putin's leadership. There's also the mention of the word cooperative in the title to consider. The Telegraph says that this refers to Lake Cooperative, which is where Putin and his cronies travel for their vacations. That means the song also sends the clearest possible message to the Kremlin. There can be no spin, no turning of this protest into propaganda. Hundreds of Russians have brazenly gathered in St. Petersburg to tell Putin that they want him out, and there is no chance that he won't hear the message. Putin is starting to get paranoid. And the reason behind the protest demonstrates how this paranoia is starting to get the best of him. We've already touched on how Putin's suppression of the arts is one of the Kremlin's key tactics when it comes to controlling the Russian masses. Just weeks before the St. Petersburg protest, Russia took its attempts to suppress to a new extreme. On July 25th, DW reported that the Russian parliament had approved new legislation that allows Russia to levy fines against any citizens who access content online that the Russian state deems extremist. What actually constitutes extremist content is vague, with the Kremlin having released a list of materials that contain over 5,000 entries. This suggests that the Kremlin intends to use this new law to crack down on anything that shows even the slightest hint of opposition to Putin. The new legislation also enables Russia to punish anybody who promotes VPNs in the country, which Russia hopes will make its control over online content absolute. The likes of Noize MC will never be able to reach Russians who don't have access to VPNs. Those brave enough to watch his videos online without a VPN will face fines of up to $64 per offense. That may not seem like much, but in a country where the average wage is a little over $1,050 per month, $64 is a lot of money to potentially spend on watching a music video or looking at a pamphlet that says something Putin doesn't like. Putin wants to silence all dissent. October 14th proves that he can't. Now Russia's leader is growing ever more paranoid that a coup is imminent, and that can be seen from the actions that the Kremlin took on the very same day as the St. Petersburg protest. On October 14th, the New York Times reported that Russia's Federal Security Service, or FSB, had announced a new series of terrorism investigations into around 24 anti-war Russians. In particular, the FSB said it would be looking into a group that it called the Russian Anti-War Committee, which it says is plotting to overthrow the government. That committee, which was created by an exiled anti-Kremlin tycoon named Mikhail Khodorkovsky, includes many of the politicians, law professors, and other professionals who either escaped or were exiled from Russia in the wake of Putin launching his Ukraine invasion. Putin is so terrified of this group that he has the FSB releasing statements claiming that the Russian Anti-War Committee is trying to seize power by force and change the constitutional order in Russia. How is the group doing that? By funding the Ukrainian war effort and recruiting people who are still inside Russia to act on its behalf, the FSB claims. There's some interesting timing going on here. Within hours of the FSB launching this investigation, a protest that very pointedly calls for Putin to be overthrown occurred. Right now, there doesn't seem to be an established link between the FSB's new campaign and the protest, but Putin will be forced to ask himself some questions. Is there a link? Did the Russian anti-war committee help to set up this protest? If it did, does that mean the FSB's investigation has failed before it even started? Putin may never know the answers. But the true depths to which his paranoia has led him are revealed in the 23 targets of the FSB's new probe. Almost all are professionals who, the New York Times says, have declared no ambitions of challenging Putin politically. They are merely people who have spoken out about his policies and his war in Ukraine. Several are even people who have worked for or with Putin in the past, including some who once sat on Russia's Council for Human Rights and others who have previously advised the Putin government in an independent capacity. The existence of this council and these advisors is another example of Putin's growing paranoia. Though it would be inaccurate to call Putin a man who was anything other than an authoritarian, he has at least welcomed opinions of others in the past. Dissent was always something that he opposed, but he is also a man who once said, "I cannot imagine my own country in isolation from Europe and what we have often called the civilized world," when serving as Russia's acting president in the wake of Boris Yeltsin's 1999 resignation. What we're seeing with the various crackdowns Putin is now ordering is the completion of a portrait of paranoia that has evolved over time. As The Guardian reported in 2015, where Putin was once willing to cooperate with NATO, even begrudgingly, he has become far more intolerant of the West. By Putin's third term, he seemed to have transformed into a leader who wanted to suppress all dissent. A decade after that Guardian piece, Putin has only gotten worse. Now he won't listen to anybody who tries to counsel him unless they already agree with his opinions. The Kremlin is filled with yes men because those who say anything contrary to Putin inevitably get arrested, deported, or disappeared. Putin is losing himself to his paranoia. The October 14th protests will give him even more reason to worry for several reasons. The first is the very fact that these protests happened at all highlights how poorly the Kremlin has fared in preventing information from reaching the eyes and ears of those inside Russia who are willing to seek it. Russia may be trying to eliminate VPNs, but people are still using them. It's trying to suppress the voices or artists such as Noize MC, but people are still hearing them. If the attempted suppression of dissent is the chief symptom of Putin's paranoia, his failure to achieve his goal will only make that paranoia worse. Now, anti-war sentiment is starting to grow inside Russia. In the wake of the FSB announcing its crackdown on the Russian anti-war committee, Khodorkovsky took to X to explain why Putin has ordered the investigations. "The threat we truly pose to Putin comes from our function as an alternative point of legitimacy," Khodorkovsky wrote. "If our work has rattled him to this extent, then clearly our approach is the correct one." Rattled seems to be an understatement. Putin is so lost in his need to rid himself of any dissent that his facade is starting to crack, and many people inside Russia are starting to see the weakness in the supposed strongman of Russian politics. Khodorkovsky highlighted that Putin himself understands this, and he's been targeting the Russian anti-war committee for doing the things that Putin should have been doing all along. What it has been doing, Khodorkovsky says of his committee, is building relationships with international institutions and acting in the interests of Russian citizens, something the regime itself has abandoned all pretense of doing. Putin will also see that the sentiment toward his war is slowly changing in Russia. On the surface, most in Russia support the Ukraine war, the Journal of Democracy reported back in February 2025, which is when talks of a ceasefire started to arise. Whether that support is genuine or is born from fear of the tactics Putin uses against dissenters is up for debate. However, the outlet points to an interesting survey from November 2024 that found that 57% of Russians favored a ceasefire compared to 35% who wanted to continue the war. It's been almost a year since that survey, and the chance to declare a ceasefire has passed. It's possible that the majority of Russians who want the war to stop, even if just temporarily, has grown, both in size and frustration. Putin had his chance to bring an end to this war. Now he has people protesting on the streets as he desperately tries to prevent anybody from talking about his many failures as Russian leader. Coming back to the St. Petersburg protest, we also can't ignore the demographic in play here. Most of the protesters are fairly young, with many likely being in their teens or 20s. This is the next generation of Russia, and it knows that Putin doesn't care about them at all. There are many reports of Putin very happily exploiting his nation's youth to achieve his goals in Ukraine. When Russia conscripted 160,000 new soldiers in April, which was the largest single conscription in Russia since 2011, all of the men called up were between the ages of 18 and 30. Many of these young men have yet to have a chance to really start their adult lives, and Putin is now forcing them to train so they can enter a war that has claimed over 1.12 million of their country people and counting. In July, the BBC reported that Putin had also broken his promise that no 18-year-old conscripts would fight in Ukraine. He was lying. At least 245 soldiers confirmed to be aged 18 have died in Ukraine during the past 2 years, the BBC says. And now Putin is even trying to groom abducted Ukrainian children to fight in his army. That's according to The Guardian, which says that Russia has a network of 200 camps built to brainwash Ukraine's abducted children. Those camps employ military-style training tactics, and it's possible that some of those who have been snatched from Ukraine have already been sent to the front lines. To many of the young in Russia, it might seem like Putin has an agenda against them. There may be a good reason for that. In May 2024, the Chicago Council on Global Affairs revealed the results of a joint survey it conducted with the Levada Analytical Center. That survey asked young Russians where they get most of their news from, and the answer was the last thing that Putin would have wanted to hear. The majority of those surveyed, the council claims, said they don't trust Russia's state-owned television, radio, and media stations to provide them with real information, so they're turning to online platforms and social media to get their news. The council found that 61% of Russians aged between 18 and 34 most often turn to social media to learn about what's going on. A further 37% say they use Telegram, with 36% stating they look for news on websites. Television comes fourth in the list, with 34% of young adults saying they use that particular platform. As for radio and newspapers, barely anyone aged 18 to 34 pays attention to them based on the survey results. Putin is likely very aware of the fact that his country's young people aren't looking to their almighty leader and his cronies for their information. That's why he suppresses. It's why everything Putin has done to spark the St. Petersburg protests targeted the platforms and people who are starting to sway Russia's young adults. Putin hopes that punishment and suppression will be the salve for his paranoid belief that young people are ready to depose him. If that doesn't work, he'll just keep sending those young people to the front lines, which only feeds the fire of anti-war sentiment that is building in a segment of Russia's population over which Putin can't exert full control. The question now seems to be, what will get Putin first? He seems to believe that it's the young people and extremists who are willing to speak out against him. However, it might also be the Dutch disease that's rotting Russia from within. Find out what that disease is and what it means for Putin in our video. And if you enjoyed this video, remember to subscribe to The Military Show for more coverage of the latest developments inside Russia. And thank you, as always, for watching.